Well, hello, friends, and welcome to episode 4 of Life, Love, God. And today we're going to be talking about chapter 3, Jin Chao, I Meet a Real Prophet. Um, on the last slide today, you'll see some links where you can purchase your own copy of this book. And I'm just going to cover a few of what I think are highlights in this chapter. But I have to be honest, the first time that I read this chapter, which has been quite a few years ago, my first question was, why? Why did Brother Norm include this story in his autobiography? And the more that I've studied this now, the more I realize that there was a point that Norm was trying to get across, and that was how he was prepared to become a spiritual leader. So let's look a little bit at Jin Chao's life. Who was he? Well, Jin Chao was born in 1857 in China. His grandfather had been a well-known Chinese prophet, and he made the mistake of correctly predicting problems with the Chinese emperor's future. And because he was correct, he was imprisoned. And my understanding was he died in prison. In 1873, at the age of 16, Jin Chao boarded a ship, left China for California. He eventually ended up in Santa Barbara, where he washed dishes in a restaurant in Santa Barbara. And then later he became a houseboy for a prominent family, the Hollister family of Hollister Ranch. And they paid him a generous amount each week, and he saved his money, and he bought his own farm in Goleta. And in 1912, after selling his Goleta farm to the Southern Pacific Railroad, he had enough money to buy a small farm on the San Ynez River in Lompoc. So Jin Chao was married. He met his wife Jenny in Northern California, and together they had 4 children, Laura, Chester, Clara, and Pearl. In 1932, Jin Chao was gored by a bull on his farm and was hospitalized in Santa Barbara. The doctors told him that he might not live, and he told the doctors, "This is not my time. My time will come 1 year later." And what was interesting about that, as a prophet, 1 year later to the very day, Jin Chao was struck by an automobile as he crossed State Street in Santa Barbara, and he died that day of his injuries. So he was called a prophet because he had the uncanny ability to predict the weather as well as to foresee world events. So he accurately predicted the 1923 earthquake in Japan and the 1925 earthquake in Santa Barbara. He predicted that the U.S. and Japan would be at war, and that would end somewhere around 1946. And he made weather predictions constantly, which he posted on a bulletin board in the Santa Barbara post office. Eventually, his weather forecasting was so much more correct than the National Weather Service that he was asked to print his forecasting, and so he began an almanac for each year starting in 1932, and then he had a second almanac in 1933. So there were only 2 years of almanacs due to his death in 1933. So, towards the end of his life, Jin Chao had joined with other farmers in the San Ynez River Valley to bring a lawsuit against the cities of Santa Barbara and Montecito for taking their water. You see, the Gibraltar Dam had been built on the San Ynez River, and this was clearly affecting water to the farms downstream. And he did not believe that was fair. And he also had a connection to the state because Charles Paulsen's wife, Eileen, was on the state water board, who was working with this same issue, is all over California, whose water is it? And so it was a very serious time when it came to water. Kind of an odd story that after Jin Chao passed away, his son Chester took all of his ancient books from China that he'd inherited from his grandfather, as well as his almanacs that he'd printed, and he burned them all. So today, Jin Chao's legacy is, it's still there in Lompoc. You see in the very center here is a mural on one of the buildings in Lompoc, and you see Jin Chao there to the right hand side with a raised collar and a tie on. His grave is in the Lompoc cemetery, and as you see, the grave says Jin Chao, the prophet. And on the far left is his obituary from the Lompoc Record. And his obituary appeared in the Santa Barbara News Press. It also appeared in newspapers all over the country because at that time Jin Chao's popularity and fame had gone nationwide, at least. So this chapter starts out with a visit to Jin Chao. Now, Charlie's blind, so he needs some eyes, and Norm is about between 2.5 and 3, and they walk a good, I believe it's 3 miles or more from their house on K Street to the farm of Jin Chao. And his father says, "There's an old friend of mine who wants to meet you. His name is Jin Chao." And then Norm writes, "Jin Chao lived down by the river at the east end of the valley. He had a small vegetable farm and a couple of cows and some chickens. It was a good 3-mile walk from the house on K Street, and as we drew near the farm, Dad was giving directions. 'Norman, do you see a little cabin down by the river near the willows?'" So this is where Jin Chao's Lompoc farm was. It was on the west side of the Robinson's Bridge. Actually, I have that wrong. It was on the east side of the Robinson Bridge. And if you see the picture on the left is the old Robinson Bridge, the one-laner before it washed out. And you can't see the farm. The bridge is actually blocking part of the property where Jin Chao's farm was. But if you see this aerial view here on the right with the red arrow, that's approximately where his farm was. Today, if you were to cross the new Robinson's Bridge, as you get to the other side, that's where the county yard is. And there's a small road there. If you turn on that road and drive behind the county yard, you'll see a farmhouse that's very new, painted yellow, and then you'll see an old home and part of an old windmill left over that's also painted yellow. And according to the Historical Society, they believe that was remnants of Jin Chao's farm. So that's where the farm was. So the question for me was, who was Jin Chao to Charles Paulsen? Why was he important? Well, first of all, Charlie Paulsen was a Buddhist, a practicing Buddhist, and Jin Chao was one of the few Buddhists in the Lompoc area. But in the chapter, as you read through there's a bomb that's dropped in this chapter, and it says, "My father confided in me that Jin Chao had been his spiritual guide from 1912, when Dad was only 18, to the time of Master Jin's passing in June of 1933. And so Jin Chao and Charles Paulsen had what, in my opinion, would be similar to a guru-disciple relationship or a spiritual teacher to a disciple relationship. And they may have spent some lifetimes together, and apparently they would be spending future lifetimes, because before he passed away, Jin Chao told Charles, I'll be leaving soon, but we'll meet again. So there was no doubt that they had gone through lifetimes together as possibly a guru-disciple relationship. Now, when Brother Norm first met Jin Chao, here's how he describes Jin Chao. He said, "I felt an inner scrutiny begin. Like many shock waves, it moved through me. Jin Chao was looking me over. This is interesting. So Jin Chao had physical eyes and he was looking at Norman. But what Norman was feeling wasn't what you would see with your physical eyes. Jin Chao was looking into Norm. He was looking into probably his energy centers to see how advanced he was, how clear his spiritual pathway was. And he said to Charlie, or Charles, he said, "Charlie, this boy's spirit is very old. Know much. Been around a long time. Helped lots of people." And then Norm said, "He placed his right hand on my head. Charlie, I give him blessing of ancient ancestors, okay?" And Charles Paulsen replied, "Whatever you can do for him, Master Jin, is appreciated. As I've said before, I feel he has a big work ahead of him." So I had read this a number of times, and it never really dawned on me until I began to read and meditate on this chapter in preparation for this, and I realized this was Jin Chao looking at the basically the spiritual barometer of Norm. He was looking through him, and it reminded me of an encounter that Norm had much later in his life with Babaji. And Norm described it this way. He said, "While meditating deeply in the backyard one night, with closed eyes, I observed the astral panorama surrounding my physical body. Yet I could clearly see the objects of the physical world. Some were moving and some were stationary. The landscape was visible in a veil of penetrating light. I observed in the east an orb of brilliantly white light rapidly approaching. To my delight, it came directly to me and hovered at eye level. A voice floated upon the ethereal atmospheres. 'I am the one they call Babaji.' I remembered well Yogananda's description of an ever-youthful figure called Babaji, meaning Holy Father. He was the spiritual guide of Lahiri Mayasaya, Sri Yukteswar's teacher. In my meditation, I watched Babaji in a spherical form of white light transit down the full length of my spine, then came back up, emerging through the crown of my head. Hovering again before me, he silently projected in thought form his pleasure at finding the way open through all my spinal centers. Babaji offered support for the endeavors I had undertaken, and then he left as he had come, traveling towards his favorite haunts in the high Himalayas." So, twice at least in his lifetime, and possibly 3 times, because I'm sure that Yogananda looked at Norman and made the same, came to the same conclusions as Babaji and Jin Chao. But I think this story is interesting for another similarity. You know, Norm received a blessing from Charles' spiritual teacher, just as Yogananda had received a blessing from his mother and father's guru, Lahiri Mayasaya. A year after Yogananda's mother had died, his brother Ananta gave Yogananda a letter that his mother left for him. She wrote, "I first knew your destined path when you were but a babe in my arms. I carried you to the home of my guru in Benares. Almost hidden behind a throng of disciples, I could barely see Lahiri Mayasaya as he sat in deep meditation. While I patted you, I was praying that the great guru take notice and bestow a blessing. As my silent devotional demand grew in intensity, he opened his eyes and beckoned me to approach. The others made a way for me. I bowed at the sacred feet. My master seated you upon his lap, placed his hand on your forehead in the way of spiritually baptizing you. Little mother, thy son will be a yogi. As a spiritual engine, he will carry many souls to God's kingdom." This struck me that it's similar to what Jin Chao had said when he said, "This boy's spirit is very old, knows much, been around a long time, helped lots of people." Norm did have a big work ahead of him, as his father had seen. And, he's one of the few direct disciples of Yogananda that actually went out and started World Brotherhood colonies. He was one of the few disciples to actually write about his experiences with Master and his own experiences with his spiritual path. After reading this chapter and meditating on this chapter and what was important in this chapter, another thing popped out for me, and that was at the end of this chapter are some words of wisdom that came from Jin Chao, but little pearls. And one of those that I read at the end of that chapter was, "Man should believe in God. If he follows Christ, Confucius, Buddha, all right." In other words, Jin Chao was echoing a very strong message, the same message that Yogananda brought to this country. Yogananda said, "To me there is neither Jew nor Christian nor Hindu, all are my brothers. I worship in all temples, for each of them has been erected to honor my Father." He was saying that all paths share a similar goal, just as Jin Chao had said, communion with Spirit. In 1942, 9 years after Jin Chao passed away, SRF completed the Hollywood Temple, and over the entrance, Yogananda had a large sign placed there that said, "The Church of All Religions." I believe that Brother Norm was being groomed as a spiritual leader. At the age of between 1.5 and 2, he had samadhi in his backyard. He remembered his birth, and he remembered friends from his previous lives. He had a blessing from his parents' spiritual guide. He had the spiritual guide of his father look at his spiritual makeup to see if his paths were open and what his destiny was. Very interesting things when we consider what we're reading now. Norma's only around the age of 3. So as we prepare for next month, please read the chapter School and the Strange Encounter. But thank you for listening, and you guys have a great month. Thank you.